Hey folks, it is Dr. DiBiase. As I mentioned in my email, I have come down with the flu, and in the same way that I do not want you guys coming to class if you are sick, I was not going to make you sit through me kind of coughing and sneezing and being genuinely miserable. So what we're going to do is I'm going to run us through some of the discussion that we would have done if I had been able to run class in person. And by the end of this video, I'll kind of go over a few things that I would like for you to focus on as you are working on revisions towards your final drafts to be submitted by the end of Friday. So, what we're going to talk about today is source use and citation, which is an important part of any kind of academic writing procedure, and has relevance to the third section of your proposals, where you are explicitly drawing on outside sources in order to make your case for why your project concept is connected to the broader ideas of the class. So as we go through these slides, and I'll make these slides available on Blackboard as well so that you can go back and reference them, where I think this is most relevant to the work that we're doing, but also just to give you a good overview of why we do attribution in the way that we do it and why it matters. So we'll talk a little bit about different citation styles, their differences, at least philosophically, and then as our example today, we'll be thinking about the Modern Language Association citation guidelines, and we'll be taking a look at that in the context of some of the works we've read so far this semester. So what is a citation style, right? You may be familiar with some of these. It's a way of documenting the works that we use that gets tied to a larger set of style guidelines. So some examples would be the Modern Language Association, the American Psychological Association, Chicago Manual, or the IEEE, right? And these are all systems of not just citation, but also systems of writing style that govern the way that writing in particular disciplines occurs. And when I say that they are sort of style guidelines, this includes everything from what kind of pronoun usage to use when we are talking about a generic individual, to whether or not a phrase like black or white referring to a racial category should be capitalized, to guidelines, as we'll discuss later, for whether or not you should use direct quotations or paraphrasing. So citations are a smaller part of larger sort of style documentation. So citation styles tell us a lot of things, right? They can tell us how we are supposed to cite a source, right? How we are supposed to reference a source. They give us guidance for how we should present a source. So, for example, do we use a direct quote from the original source, or is it considered better, or in some cases even required, to paraphrase? They also offer us some insights into the values of the fields that use that citation system, right? So as we've talked about this semester, writing and values are closely linked together. Rhetoric and values are closely linked together. Communities around a discourse and values are closely linked together, and so citation systems do tell us something about at least some of the values of a particular academic community. Now, as a quick aside, why do we want to care about using citations effectively? Well, there are connections to, I know I say Brandt and G at the top, but there's some Downs connections as well, right? So for Brandt, right, making use of a particular kind of citation system would signal that you have kind of mastered that kind of literacy, right, as a marker of a particular kind of literacy. Downs would perhaps tell us that citation choices speak to our audience's values, right? So we cite because our audiences expect us to cite, and we cite in a particular way because our audiences expect and anticipate a certain kind of citation. And so by abiding by those expectations, right, we are able to appeal to the values that shape our audience's sense of credibility as sort of a broader appeal to ethos. For G, right, we might even think about citations systems as a test, right? So, he talks a lot about how communities are always sort of on the look for markers that that demonstrate whether an individual belongs or does not belong to a particular community, right? And so if we, for example, fail to cite effectively or at all, or we use the wrong citation system, right, then we are betraying perhaps our inexperience with a particular academic discourse. So how do we cite a source, right? How do we make reference to a source that we are using? Typically, regardless of the citation system, we see two different pieces going into any citation, right? There is the in-text citation. This is some kind of marker within the body of the text that signals to the reader that we are drawing from the work of another scholar. And if you recall our library session from earlier this week, right, Talanda spent a lot of time talking about why attribution is so critical for the scholarly community. Now, what this in-text marker will look like is going to vary on the basis of the system we're using. So, for example, APA and MLA have what we call a parenthetical in-text citation. Chicago can use either footnotes or endnotes, right? There are marked usually with a superscript above a word, right? A numerical superscript that points us to a footnote or an endnote. And then there is typically some sort of longer, more thorough citation that gives us the full bibliographic information that we need for the text that we are referring to. So, that might be part of a works cited page or a reference page or a bibliography, right? What's labeled will vary based on the style of system we're using. It might be what the footnote or endnote points to, right? So you might find in the bottom margins of the page, right, the full citation of the text, or perhaps if it's an endnote, right, the in-text marker points us to the end of a chapter or a book, and we can find the fuller information about the text. And each system, right, is going to give us something about the formatting rules for both the in-text and the sort of larger version, amongst other things. So how do we present a source, right? Well, this can vary from system to system. So for example, in the MLA style guide, we are free to use either direct quotes or we can use paraphrases, right? We can directly quote material straight from the text that we are using, or we can provide our own summation of that text in our own words that maybe fits better with the tone that we're using, or perhaps makes the content a little bit more accessible for a less experienced audience. In contrast, the APA system, the American Psychological Association system, has a strong, almost compulsory preference for paraphrase. And this tells us a little bit about the values of these particular sources or these particular citation styles, right? MLA typically is aligned with fields that make a lot of use of primary texts where the original language of the text is important, where the specific language of the author matters. It's seen to be more significant. And so direct quotes are often appropriate. In the American Psychological Association system, right? And again, don't get thrown off by psychological there. It's used by lots of different disciplines, not just psychology. The direct language is not considered as important. What's important is your ability to convey the information in that particular text to your audience in your own words. And so, for example, if you were writing a paper and your professor said, I want you to use the APA style, you would not use direct quotes, right? Or you would try to avoid them as much as you can, right? Whereas if you were using MLA, you would not only be allowed to use direct quotes, there might be specific kinds of writing that you would do where it would be weird not to use a direct quote. So again, these speak to, again, how much does speaker language matter, right? But also, right, for example, MLA citations, right, the in-text citation, as we're going to see shortly, does not include the year of publication, whereas APA style citations do. And in part, this is because of different values around timeliness versus timelessness. In MLA, when the piece was published is not as critical. We might say it's because there is a sense that, as an example, right, a piece of scholarship around, the works of Shakespeare written 20 years ago might be as valid today as it was when it was originally published. However, APA and other citation styles that draw on more timely work, right? So if we think about like medical research or scientific research, this changes often enough where knowing when a piece was published is really relevant to thinking about how compelling a piece of evidence it is, right? If you cite a psychological study or a medical study or a biology study from 1973 in an argument that you're making, you have some work to do to convince your audience as to why we would care about research that was conducted in that field 50 years ago. So common questions that people might ask around citation. And again, some of this got touched on in our Thursday session, but I'll touch on it lightly here. When should I cite? How do I know which system I should use? And is it okay to use citation websites? So I'll tackle these really briefly, right? When should you be citing material? Essentially, right, if you are using the ideas of another scholar, right, or you are drawing upon research conducted by other individuals or the ideas of other individuals, you want to be citing that material. You want to give credit to the authors who performed the labor of compiling and writing up the research. We do this because there's sort of a moral imperative to do so, right? To give credit where credit is due. We do this because citation is one of the key ways in which scholars build their careers. We also do it as a gift to our readership, right? To give them the opportunity to further explore a topic, right? If you cite a study in the context of your project and they find it very interesting, they might go out and seek out that source for themselves. It also serves as a form of accountability, right? If my audience knows where I'm getting my information from, then I have to use that information responsibly because they can go back and check to see, am I using this work in context, right? Am I manipulating the data? Am I misrepresenting what the original author said? For our purposes, for our proposals, anytime we are referring back to one of the course text ideas, right? Whether we're talking about discourse or rhetorical ecologies or literacy sponsors, or even if we're using a more common term but in a specific way, like we could talk about values in general, but if we're talking about values through the lens of Downs or G, then we have to cite where they make use of that terminology. How will I know which system I should use? Well, every system is tied to a particular kind of academic discourse, and honestly, the best way to understand what the expectations are would be to sort of see what your professors are asking for, or to see what kinds of citation styles are used in the field of study that you are working in. While we will be using MLA as an exercise for this proposal, although if you want to use a different one and feel confident in doing so, you are welcome to do so. You can do this kind of, as you move through your particular major, you will get a clearer sense of the guidelines for your academic discipline and grow in experience with making use of them. Now, that said, I've been doing this for decades now, and I still don't have all of the various citation rules memorized. And so, students will ask, is it okay to use a citation website? Yeah, it's okay, right? Now, there are a lot of options for which ones you use. On the one hand, we have traditional citation builders. In terms of free stuff, EasyBib is a very common one. But if you're used to using EasyBib, I would strongly recommend that you look at Zotero, which is a free service. Well, it's free for you. The library pays quite a bit for it. but it generates typically more accurate citations and enables you to kind of save all of your documentation that you find through the library website in a single account. And I think all of those, any of those citation builders are fine. Use the ones that you're most comfortable with, but you do want to give a double check the citation that kind of comes out of it to just check for any errors in translation or mechanics, etc. Alternatively, students have been increasingly turning to generative AI to produce citations for their work by saying, I need a citation for X text in such and such style. Now, this can work, but there's no guarantee. If you only give it the most basic information in terms of the text, it may not have access in its training data to all of the other elements that we'll see later that you would need to compile an accurate citation. It might simply omit those elements, or it might go ahead and generate or hallucinate, right, things to fit in the gaps that are there. Alternatively, if you give it a lot of information, right, well, here's the author, the edition, etc., 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 and ask it to format in MLA style, you may have more luck. That said, I would not trust a generative AI process for developing an accurate citation more than I would trust something like Zotero or EasyBib. Alternatively, there are no shortage of websites out there where you can look up the actual guidelines for citing different kinds of documents. Students will often talk about, particularly later this semester when we're doing the scripts, well, how do I cite an interview? There's a rule for that, right? We're not going to talk about it right now, but basically any kind of text that you might want to cite, there is some set of guidelines for how you should do so, and those are typically easy to access online. So let's talk about MLA citation. So MLA citation, like many citation systems, makes use of two components. It has an in-text citation and a works cited page. So every text that you refer back to in a piece using MLA citation will need to have an in-text citation pointing us to what it is that we are looking at, and is going to need a full bibliographic citation that lays out all of the key publication information for the text that you use. So if you give it an in-text citation, somewhere else in your works cited page, it will need to have a fully formatted, full bibliographic citation. So in terms of in-text citations, right, this is how we signal source usage to our reader. We use them, and this is really important, whether we are paraphrasing, right, putting a concept in our own words, and when we use direct quotation. Now, a lot of students will assume that we only use it for direct quotation, but if we are paraphrasing, we need to use a citation as well. So if I said something to the effect of, in Deborah Brandt's essay, Sponsors of Literacy, she describes sponsors of literacy as individuals who have an impact in various ways on someone's literacy development. Now, that's not a direct quote. That's my paraphrase. But just because it's in my own words does not mean that I can get away with not listing a citation, right? I have to cite where that idea that I am summarizing initially came from. And again, anytime I do an in-text citation, it will have to correspond with an entry in my works cited page. So what should the formatting look like? There are two requirements if we have access to them for MLA. We need the author or author's last name, and we need the page number if there is a page number. So for example, if we were citing Brandt, right, we would put Brandt 75, right, if it appeared on page 75 of the text. We put it within the end punctuation. So the author argues that literacy sponsors are not always, quote, altruistic, right? I'm putting, quote, altruistic in quotes because she does use that specific language. And then I'm saying Brandt 76 because that is the page for the text I was looking at where that term and that concept applies. Now, this is also why that works cited entry is so important, because you can find a copy of Brandt's essay in lots of different locations, and they will all have different page numbers, right, depending on where it was published. So the page number is only useful if you know the specific publication that I'm discussing. Now, there are sometimes exceptions, right? Sometimes we are citing something with no clear author or organization. Maybe it's published anonymously. We can use a shortened version of the title. So let's pretend for a moment that Sponsors of Literacy had no known author. I would, instead of saying, Brant 75, I might put in quotes sponsors, and then 75, right? If there's no page numbers, you just omit the page numbers. Page numbers are significantly less relevant for digital texts than they used to be, mostly because you can just search within the browser for the terminology, right? So if I pull up a website that I'm citing or someone's citing and I want to find that quote, I can just Control or Command F and type in part of the quote, and I will find that citation there. Years and years and years ago, this was a bigger problem where there was no in-browser search support, but that is a vestige of times long since past. Now, after we've done our in-text citations, we have to format our works cited page, right? So we're going to have one entry for every source we've used. Typically, we're going to use a hanging indent. So what that means is that the first line of a works cited entry is all the way up against your left margin, and then anything that kind of spills over to the next line gets indented, one indent, typically half an inch. For our proposals, this is not incredibly relevant because you don't have that many sources, maybe one, maybe two. But if you're doing a work with a lot of sources, having that hanging indent makes it just easier to visualize the information on the page. They get organized alphabetically, so if you were using Downs and Brant in your proposal, you would cite Brant first and then Downs second in your works cited page, regardless of the order that they appeared in your actual text. And we single space our entries with a space between each entry. MLA is really interesting because it doesn't really use a prescriptive set of guidelines for how to cite a specific source. The reality is that the range of texts that people use in scholarship that happens within MLA fields is so vast that not every source is going to have the same kinds of identifying information. So instead, what we have is a system where you basically provide as much information as you are able to find. So you start with the author with a period, and that should be last name, comma, first name. Then you would have the title of the source, and that would be typically the article. It might be a book title, but it could be, right, if it's an article, that would be the article title. There'd be the title of what we call the container. So if we were talking about an episode, then the container would be the series. If we were talking about a journal article, the container would be the journal. If we're talking about an essay in a collection, right, the source is the essay, the container is the collection. So like if we were using one of the short pieces from Naming What We Know, right, that would be an example of that. There might be other contributors, so that would include editors, and that's relevant for Downs and G. It might include translators, not relevant for our work for this particular project, but in other contexts that might be relevant. There might be a version, right, or a number, or a volume. So, for example, we might have the third edition of a book. We might have, as was discussed during the library session, volume 3, issue 7. For books in particular, we try to include the name of the publisher and the publication date if we have access to it, as well as the location. Now, location here does not mean where it was physically published. It means like where in the text was this material that you used. So this is relevant with a digital source, right? You would include the URL. Or if you are using a portion of a larger work, right? So a chapter in a book, right? Or an essay in a book, you would need the page numbers of that particular chapter. And that will be relevant now that I think about it for G, Downs, Brant, or any of the Naming What We Know authors, where you have a smaller work embodied in a much longer piece. So let's go over what information you're going to need for the various sources that we're looking at. So if you're using any of the authors from Naming What We Know, remember, you can't just cite Naming What We Know. It is a big collection with lots of individual pieces. So you're going to need to go to the reading. Doesn't matter which one, which chapter. If you go to the first page, you're going to find something that says for additional information. There's a link for that. And that's going to give you the relevant information for the text. In fact, you'll find a view citation link to get the MLA citation. But you're going to have to edit that citation because the one they're going to give you is just for the book. It will not be for the specific essay that you're citing. So if you're looking at like words get their meaning from other words, you would need to say, author's name, words get their meaning from other words, blah, 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 naming what we know, and then move along. For Brandt, all of the relevant information you're going to need will be on the first page of that file. But you're going to need to format it for MLA using the guidelines that were earlier in this presentation, right? You're going to have to go back to this slide and assemble the information as best you can from what you get from that text. For Downs and G, I'm going to give you some of the information you're going to need. So the title of the work that these essays came from was Writing About Writing 3rd edition. I'm giving you the names of the editors, right? That would go in the contributors section. It was published by Bedford St. Martin's in 2017. So that'll give you sort of a sense of some of the information that you're going to need. One thing you might notice here, right? Notice that I've got Writing About Writing in italics. Notice here I've got Naming What We Know in italics. Book titles, right? The containers go in italics. The titles of the articles that you're using would be going in quotation marks. I noticed in a lot of the drafts that people were italicizing things like Sponsors of Literacy, but that's just an article title that goes in quotation marks and no italics at all. So, before we start wrapping up, a couple of goals for your draft. 1, make sure that you're strengthening your use of your scholarly text, right? Be specific. If you say something like, in Brandt's essay, she talks about Sponsors of Literacy, make sure you take a minute or two to unpack what that text means. Also, a quick note, and I should have made a slide for this, and I didn't. I apologize. I might go back and add it before I post these to Blackboard. The first time you refer to an author in MLA, you need to use their entire name. So in Deborah Brandt's essay, she notes blah, 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 blah. Every subsequent time you use her name, you will just use her last name, right? Brandt. Same thing with James Paul G's essay on literacy, discourse and linguistics. He notes blah, blah, blah. In fact, G says da, 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 da. I want you to make sure that you are using clear direct quotes or paraphrases of the relevant ideas and citing them, right? So include an MLA style in-text citation for what you're using. Go find the page where that key idea gets discussed in the way that you're thinking about it. And you're going to put a full MLA works cited citation for your source texts at the end of your proposal. So for most of you, that's just going to be one, but it's possible that you might have more than one. I've seen a couple of drafts where people are citing more than one kind of core text, which is really cool to see, but you're going to need to make sure that you are then providing a works cited entry for all of those texts. More broadly, just some 3 big points I want to make. We would have worked on this in pairs in class and made time to kind of do this kind of revision in class, but obviously that's not happening. 1, make use of headings and paragraphing, right? Do not submit your final draft as one long paragraph or even as 3 interconnected paragraphs. Each section should have a heading based on the headings in the proposal guidelines. And if you are covering a good amount of material in those sections, it's okay to paragraph them, right? You don't have to have the first section be just a single paragraph. The third section should be at least 3 to 4 paragraphs, and I've given you guidelines for that in the proposal discussions. Make sure you check all of your sections, right? Is each section accomplishing the goals that it is supposed to do, right? So am I leaving the opening section with a clear sense of this community, a clear, concrete, objective sense of this community? In the second section, am I getting a specific understanding of why you care about this community? In the third section, am I getting a clear sense of what is sort of the grounding for this project and how it sets us up for the research you're going to do? We also want to make sure that we're not getting too much bleed between sections, right? So don't tell me in your first section how meaningful your experience in this community was, right? That belongs in the second section. Don't include details about the composition of your community in section 2 when those are supposed to be in section 1. And finally, right, try to work towards building a cohesive arc across your different sections, right? Work backwards. If this is a project that's asking big questions about how, coaches act as literacy sponsors, then you want to make sure that you talk about the kinds of literacies that we encounter in this community in the first part, and that there are coaches at all. You might then want to make sure in your second section, where you talk about why this community matters, that you are referencing your coaches, right, or your experiences with coaches, and why you're curious about their activities and engagement with other members of the community. Ideally, all 3 of the sections work well together to complement each other so that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. So, all that said, I'm starting to peter out, so we're going to wrap this up. You're going to continue to work on these drafts. Some of you have received some feedback from me on your first draft. Others have not yet. If you should have enough feedback from your peers at this point to do some real revision, even if you have not yet received formal feedback from me on your draft. Everyone will be getting formal feedback on the final draft after those are submitted over the course of spring break. Before we close out, just a few things I want you to think about moving forward before I forget. You should, over the next couple of days, be thinking about your next steps for this project. That means thinking about, do you want to revisit your original interview participants to come back with additional questions to ask them now that you are closer to understanding what it is this project is really looking for? Are there other people that maybe you should have interviewed or didn't have the opportunity to interview the first time around that you now would like to interview? And we'll talk about the details of this when we get back from spring break, but I am going to expect everyone to identify at least 3 outside sources that will enable you to think more critically about your topic and research questions. Now, those might be sources about your community and aspects of that community. They might be sources that help to build off of what we know about the theories, the writing studies theories that you're using, or the rhetorical theories you're using. It might be readings that help us better understand issues that came up in your interviews that you want to better be able to contextualize. We'll talk more about this when we come back. But you should consider setting up one-on-one research appointments with the reference librarians for when we get back from spring break, hopefully maybe Wednesday, Thursday, or Friday of that week, to make your source searching significantly more efficient, especially if you plan to pursue the extra annotated bibliography deeper dive, where you are going to do additional research and write-ups of that research in order to earn a deeper dive credit. I'll be doing my best to be available on Zoom during our class periods for those of us who are Thursday and Friday. I'm making no promises, but I'm going to do my best. If you cannot find me on Zoom, send me an email and we will arrange a time to have a follow-up conversation. But if there is anything you would like to discuss pertaining to your drafts, I'm happy to discuss that. I hope everyone has a good break, stay healthy, and I will see you when we return.